Hi, my name is Sean Millman. I'm a fifth-year PhD candidate in percussion performance at NYU, and I appreciate your time. This presentation, as you can see, is entitled A Deliberate Practice Loop for Music Performance Training. That's what I've been working on the last couple of years, and it's kind of the bird's eye view of my dissertation research. A little bit of background on me before I get going here. I did my first 2 degrees in percussion performance at the University of Florida. And while I was there, in addition to working, playing in ensembles and working on solo rep and chamber music and all that sort of stuff, I also got really close with the Athletic Association. I marched on the drum line during my undergrad, and then during my master's, I got plugged in with the Athletic Association, and I co-founded a student government group for the men's basketball students section. I eventually ended up working for the ticket office, selling student football tickets. And over the time that I was doing that, I kind of recognized that the Athletic Association kind of handled their business in a little bit of a different way than the music department that I was in. And then, through the last 10, 12 years of my professional and academic career, talking with colleagues and teachers and now, eventually students, I've kind of recognized that difference is not unique to the University of Florida, that it's kind of widespread, that athletics departments and music schools and athletes and musicians just kind of handle what they do in a little bit of a different way. And I started asking why. So over the course of this presentation, as you see a lot of kind of analogies and research from the sports world, that's kind of why, and hopefully you'll understand how some of these things came to be and why they're here. So as we get started, I'm going to give away the punchline straight away. So this is my loop. It has 5 elements, as you can see there: motivation, mental conceptualization, pre-performance routines, feedback, and target behaviors. I'll go over this real quick, and then we'll get into everything in a little more detail. So motivation, this part actually starts with just intrinsic motivation of the performer, in our case, musician, but this is all actually domain general to start with. So it could be an athlete, it could be, a soldier prepping for combat, or anything that is a real-time performance domain. And then you see enhanced expectancies and autonomy there, and we'll get into the research and what those things mean in a second, or in a couple of minutes, actually. And then mental conceptualization, this refers to, you can see the word there, visualization. This refers to a performer's imagined recording of what their ideal performance is, what the closest that they can come to their current idea of perfection is. And then you see pre-performance routines there. This is where we really start to move into the world of sports psychology. And this is the element of the loop that is the easiest to recognize the parallels to sports. Things like free throw shooters, and then, lots of different athletes use them. But a routine that a performer goes through in the last few seconds before they start engaging in the motor performance or the performance or the practice or whatever real-time performance is going on. That is designed to enhance their performance ability or help them reach their potential. And then we get to feedback, but before there, right between pre-performance routines and feedback, down at the bottom of the loop there, in between those two things is either the performance or significant practice reps. So the actual performance, the actual engaging in the act, goes between pre-performance routines and feedback. And then feedback, of course, is required for performers to understand what they can improve on, what is going wrong in their performance, as well as what's going right. And that comes from the 3 sources you can see there of self, peer, and coach. We'll get into that later on. And then target behaviors there. This can be simply defined as something that is usually a very small percentage of what is going on, of what creates the motor performance. A very small percentage of the overall act of doing something that has an outsized an outsized effect on the result of that performance, whether it's successful or not. So the 3 kind of discourses from which my work is largely pulled are, as you can see on your screen, expert performance, sports psychology, and motor learning. So expert performance is largely seeking to determine what makes the elite performers in a given domain that much better than all of their contemporaries, right? So why is Yo-Yo Ma Yo-Yo Ma? Why is Josh Bell Josh Bell? Why is LeBron James LeBron James? And it's not necessarily about one performer at the top of it, but what results in these elite exemplary practitioners becoming that much better than their contemporaries? It's usually focused on decades, on a career, on a lifestyle, and a lifespan, long periods of time of how someone became or can become elite in their chosen field of usually real-time performance domains. Sports psychology there is as instead of the decades-long period of time of expert performance, is focused on the right now generally. It's focused on how can someone reach their highest potential, their perfect performance, or as close to perfect as they can get in the moment, right? So, for example, for an Olympian, how can that Olympian play at their best, perform at their best in that moment at the Olympics better than they ever before in their life? And then motor learning at the bottom there, this field is also called motor skill acquisition, is largely about how we encode in our bodies and in our minds what is commonly called muscle memory, how we train our bodies to engage in a physical activity, in a motor skill correctly for whatever domain it is. So if we're going to talk about expert performance, we have to talk about this guy. This is Anders Ericsson. He's a professor at FSU right now. I think has been for quite some time. The citation there is kind of the kickstart article that began this whole field of expert performance. It's a study of violin students in Berlin in 1993 that figured out that discovered that these violin students, the ones who had practiced more over the course of their lives, were better than the ones who had practiced less over the course of their lives, which is not necessarily a groundbreaking finding, but it was groundbreaking in terms of the way that it was studied and the way that this research affected the field. So moving forward. So into the first element of the loop here, motivation. So as I mentioned before, this starts with that intrinsic motivation of just someone's desire and deciding, I want to do this, right? And then the next two pieces there, enhanced expectancies and autonomy. These are research-backed things that help motor learning be encoded and kind of increase performance and motor learning over the long term. So enhanced expectancies can be simply understood just as confidence, as the performer having evidence that they are capable of doing this successfully, whatever this is. And then autonomy there is relatively self-explanatory, that the performer has some agency or control over what they're doing. Now, obviously, autonomy increases over the course of a career. Generally, a late career elite soloist probably has some agency and some decision over the repertoire that they're playing, versus a very beginner might be beholden to what their teacher tells them to play, or that sort of thing. But that's those are the two elements that are coming from the research, and you're about to see where that comes from. So these two scholars proposed something that's called the optimal theory of motor learning. That the citation is down low there. On the left is Wolf, and on the right is Luthwaite. And basically what this theory is that there had been several rounds of findings within the motor learning discourse, and the old paradigms didn't quite fit. So these two scholars created a new theory that was designed to unify everything. And as the motor learning discourse is kind of testing this theory, they've found that it sort of holds water. So this graphic coming up here is pulled directly from that article that was cited there, the original publication of the optimal theory. And you can see the circle and then the boxes on the right. Those arrows up refer to something that increases performance, that makes the performer play better or perform better. And then that one arrow down on self-focus refers to something that makes the performer play worse. So the way that this works, as you see motor performance and motor learning on the right, the difference there, why those are two different boxes, is motor performance refers to a single instance in time, one performance, one practice rep, one execution of this motor skill, whereas motor learning refers to the arc over time of performing this skill and learning and improving, hopefully. And then you can see the loop the looping back there. The external focus thing in the bottom left, I don't want to talk too much about that for the purposes of this presentation. That basically is a finding that where they determined that if the performer is focused on their own body, that interferes with performance. You can see self-focus with an arrow down there. But if the performer is focused on something relevant to the task that is outside of their body, so a basketball player being focused on the rim of the basketball hoop, a baseball player focused on the ball, I'm a percussionist, a drummer focused on their sticks or the bass drum pedal or the drums itself, potentially a wind player focused on their airstream or something like that, something external to the body, helps performance, and that's focused on task goal, improving performance with that arrow up there. The thing that's more important for the purposes of this presentation is the top left, those two motivational factors. Enhanced expectancies, that again is confidence. That is related to, you see the arrow coming from motor performance. As an effective motor performance happens, that gives the performer that past evidence that the performer is capable and qualified to do this, and that when the performer engages in this motor skill, it is likely to go well based on the evidence of having seen it go well in the past. And then autonomy there again is some form of agency, is the performer feeling like they are in control of what's happening here, that it is their performance. And then moving forward into the second element of the loop, mental conceptualization. Now, a note about vocabulary really quickly. Within Erickson's work, this is called mental representation. The reason I don't use that term is I've been told that within the cognitive psychology world, the phrase mental representation has some very specific associations that are not how I'm using it. So I've changed my language to avoid that confusion. But this element of the loop of mental conceptualization is fundamentally the same as what Erickson refers to as mental representation, of a performer's understanding and visual and kinesthetic kind of mental imaginary representation of their ideal performance, what a perfect performance as they can conceive of it looks like right now. And this, of course, improves over time as a performer gains increased perception through long-term deliberate practice. So that's visualization, is creating that thing. Contextual interference is a pretty new field within the motor learning discourse. It's something that isn't still fully understood yet. It's an effect that hasn't been able to be fully reliably recreated. So what this is they've discovered that interfering in the learning or practicing of a motor skill by getting in the way of it makes performance worse in the short term within that practice session, but on retention, when we come back a couple of days later or the next day or a week later, actually makes things better. So for example, a 10-minute block of practice, if it's broken up in the middle by distraction and focusing on something else, will make that block of practice worse on whatever is being worked on, but the next day or the next week as we come back, retention has improved because of that. And then external focus is the same thing from the optimal theory, on focusing on something outside the body. So while we're talking about mental conceptualization, there's the PETLEP model of motor imagery. This is proposed by Holmes and Collins. The graphic on your screen here comes from the article at the bottom, Wakefield, and I'm just using that because I think it's a clearer graphic and probably the clearest graphic of what the PETLEP model is. So these 7 elements here, physical, environment, task, timing, learning, emotion, and perspective, are to Holmes and Collins. The 7 primary things that need to be accounted for within a mental conceptualization model of how to use visualization to its greatest extent for motor learning and sports psychology to improve performance. So, as you can see here, as each of these is kind of laid out on the graphic there, physical, stance and implements used. If you think about a violin player, this is the violin, the bow. Is the player sitting? Is the player standing? What's the player wearing? What kind of footwear? All of that sort of thing. The player themselves and what they're using. Environment, where is this happening? Is it a concert hall? Is it a practice room? Is it a recital hall? That sort of thing. What's the temperature like? How many people are in the audience? How many people are on stage? What's the general mood of the performance? Is it formal? Is it casual? For instrumentalists that maybe are very humidity sensitive, like double reeds for the usefulness of their reed, or percussionists with that might be using calf heads or something like that? What's the humidity like? What is the overall environment in which this performance is taking place? Task is the simplest one. What's the music being performed? What instrument am I playing? All of that sort of thing. That one's relatively easy. Timing is maybe the most complicated one to use for musicians because of the special relationship that musicians have with time. Within the Petlet model, these two authors largely hold that the timing of a visualization needs to be at full speed in order to be really relevant. Whereas for musicians, since we spend so much of our time playing things down tempo in order to clean them, in order to gain technical facility, in order to be able to encode that muscle memory correctly at a speed that our brain can handle, down tempo mental conceptualization makes sense in order to match with down tempo execution as the prep work of a piece of music or a technical exercise or an etude or whatever's being worked on is being done. Learning just refers to how one performance fits into the grand scale of many performances. Again, it's that difference between motor performance and motor learning, one instance versus many instances, and hopefully growth over time. Emotion refers to how the player feels, and also within music, it's how the player feels about a given performance and a given piece of music or a given concert program or that sort of thing, but it's also the emotions that the player would like to encode into the performance. So if you think about, a performance of an orchestral excerpt or something, it's partially how the player feels while doing this, which may be stressed, it may be relaxed, it may be focused, it may be aggressive or whatever it is. But it may also be that for that specific excerpt, the player wants to encode an emotion of sadness or joy or anger or the military, whatever it is. So those two things might be somewhat different, and they can both be accounted for within this element of the Petlet model. And the last one is perspective, which is interesting. There's kind of a discourse and maybe a disagreement or a dichotomy within the literature about usage of first-person imagery versus third-person imagery. So first person is obviously, through the eyes of the performer. What does it look like to be in that spot? And then third person is, either an out-of-body experience or something like a recording, like an imaginary camcorder video, so to speak. So then moving on to pre-performance routines. So as you can see there, the two subfields, centering and first-time execution. We'll get to centering in a second with the scholar that's on the next slide. First-time execution. So as musicians hopefully know, second-time execution is not that valuable of a skill because we almost never get a chance as performing artists to play something the second time in a scenario where it matters. It's the first time where the chips are down, so to speak. But what's happened is within these discourses, it's been learned that there's a difference between the efficacy of a brain, of the human brain, calling out its ability to execute a motor skill between long-term memory and short-term memory. And short-term memory is more efficient and higher performance. So that basically, if a performer is calling something out of long-term memory, there might be more interference, and it'll be a not as great of a performance versus short-term memory where it has been that motor skill has been very recently accessed by the brain. It's more effective and the performance is generally better, which is obviously good. So one of the things that can be built into a pre-performance routine, is to build in some way to move the brain directly into that second time short-term memory execution of a motor skill on the first real time. So, and you'll see that in a couple of slides here. So, but first we're going to talk about centering. If we're going to talk about sports psychology within orchestral music or within music performance in general, I think we have to talk about Don Green. I actually met this man about a year ago. He was a Green Beret in the United States Army and then became a sports psychologist working with Olympians and other elite athletes, and then almost by accident got involved with orchestral musicians. That's his first book on the right there that kind of details how he worked on applying his sports psychology routines with athletes toward performing musicians and elite auditioners. So the centering routine is a type of pre-performance routine that that he talks about. It's a process of 3 breaths, and the third breath is designed to go along with a cue word that goes with whatever music is about to be performed, or in the case of athletes, whatever athletic event is about to be performed. So the cue word is designed to be something that is non-technical in nature. So it's not about, fingerings in the left hand for a violin player, or fingerings for a pianist, or breath support or anything like that for wind players or instrumentalists. It's supposed to be conceptual. So big, large scale ideas like evenness or smoothness or grand or sad or tell a story, those sorts of keywords, as opposed to in time or in tune or with precision. Those sorts of things are not as great keywords because they focus on the technique of the execution as opposed to the goal and the concept of what we're trying to create. So moving forward, the next thing that's going to happen is I'm going to show a video that hopefully will work through this this Zoom recording here of Steve Nash shooting free throws during an NBA game back in the early to mid 2000s. So this is interesting for a couple of reasons. Number one is, other than Steph Curry, whose career is not over, Steve Nash is the highest percentage free throw shooter in the history of the NBA. So within his domain, he's the best to ever do this. Again, except for one player whose career hasn't ended yet, so we don't know what his final percentage is going to be. And I'll kind of narrate this video a little bit and demonstrate how exactly Nash, who again is the greatest of all time, of completed careers at this skill, how exactly Nash is using this first time, second time execution to improve his odds at this motor skill that he's performing. So moving on. We're moving into the last 2 elements of the loop here. I've kind of lumped them together for the purposes here. So feedback there, self, peer, and coach. So self is a player recognizing what's going on in their playing on their own, using their own domain-specific knowledge, which is a phrase that comes from Adrian DeGroot and chess research over many years. Peer is things within music like mock auditions and asking other musicians to listen to a player and get feedback that way. And then coach is just the most normal thing for musicians, which is just taking lessons. And then target behaviors, again, these are small elements of a motor skill that have an outsized impact on the success of that motor skill. So within our free throw analogy, I'm not a basketball player, but I know some, and or I know some coaches. And my understanding within that world is that keeping the shooting wrist and elbow straight is an important element of that skill. So that might be 2 or 5% of the overall body of everything that's going on, but it might have 40 or 50% of the resulting success or failure of the that particular motor skill. So for example, I'm a percussionist, I'm a drummer, something like grip pressure on the sticks, right? That might be over the course of, my whole body, maybe 1 or 2% of what my entire body is doing in a given motor skill, but it's also an outsized effect on how I'm able to play a given passage of music. So that's kind of how a target behavior works. They tend to be very small elements of a skill, not always, that have an outsized effect on how that skill works. So while talking about feedback, this is Jason Haheim. He teaches at NYU. He is one of the 2 principal timpanists of the Metropolitan Opera. The Met is actually the only full-time orchestra, the only ICSOM orchestra in the United States that carries 2 full-time timpanists, just because of how busy that organization is. As I mentioned, he also is an artist faculty member at NYU. I took his class a couple of times. Now I'm the TA of that class. I've worked closely with him. I've taken private lessons from him. I've worked closely with him over the last 5 years, so we know each other pretty well. And the reason I'm bringing him up is he has a unique kind of perspective on this feedback. element because while he was taking auditions before he won the job at the Metropolitan Opera, he had a full-time job working as a nanotechnologist in Chicago. So he had to kind of game the system out in order to get an effective practice routine while he was taking auditions and taking private lessons and freelancing in and around Chicago, working around a 9-to-5 full-time job. And because of that, he came up with this extremely detailed method of digitally archiving his self-recordings and his lessons so that he had this archive of everything that he had done and everything that he had learned over many years that he could go back, and if there was an excerpt that he hadn't played for 5 years, he could go back and look at the last time that he worked on it in that archive and get right back up to speed. And extremely detailed. Like I mentioned, he was a nanotechnologist, so he kind of used the scientific method to game the system of figuring out how to achieve high artistry within orchestral music. So this next slide is is one of Jason's slides. You can see the attribution at the bottom there, and Jason would say that this is largely inspired by one of his teachers, John Tafoya, who's the professor of percussion at the University of Indiana. And the idea behind this pyramid is that there are various different levels of priorities of a musical performance in order to make it effective and persuasive and a compelling musical product. And at the bottom, we have the foundations, those three kind of colored boxes there, which is time, intonation, and rhythm. So time, how are the beats in relationship to each other? Is that correct? And then rhythmic integrity, how are the notes in between the beats? Is that correct? And then intonation, obviously, is pitch. And the analogy used there is that of a three-legged stool, as you can see at the top there. The reason being, if one of those three things is wrong, if you take one of the legs off a three-legged stool, everything falls over. And then that pyramid above there, again, moves higher and higher and higher from, at the bottom of things like clarity. Are you playing just the right notes? Are you playing the right dynamics and that sort of thing? Moving up toward, high artistry and conveying a musical product. So things at the lower end might be, like high school and early undergrad and things like that someone is focused on, versus, at the top end, you're talking about international soloists really conveying a musical idea. And again, these ideas about who each of these elements applies to, and you can see on the right, prelim, semis, finals, that's targeted toward an orchestral audition audience. Those can all be changed based on need. The idea here is just to have some kind of construct that helps focus where the feedback energy needs to be focused on. So if there are intonation problems, that's a priority one, because nothing above that matters if intonation is wrong, versus if the bottom, the foundations and then the bottom two elements of that pyramid are fine, then all of a sudden the focus can shift toward the top of the pyramid. And again, all of that changes contextually, but this construct can be used to help understand how to use feedback, what is important out of that feedback, and then where given target behaviors are important. Okay, so this guy on the left here, this is United States Air Force Colonel John Boyd. He came up with what I'm showing on the right, which is called the OODA loop, which is a very common idea within the United States military, I assume other militaries as well, and also within the business world. And what Colonel Boyd came up with as he was dealing with dogfights, I believe in World War II and also Korea, was that at any given moment in a dogfight, what the pilot is dealing with is one of these four stages, which is observe and just looking around the combat area and seeing what's happening. Orient, which is for the pilot to figure out what is their current position and what is their role, how do they relate to everything that they just observed. Decide, which is to choose a course of action based on all of that information and the pilot's position within the combat area. And then act, just to engage in that course of action. And then once all of that has happened, there is a new set of circumstances that need to be observed, and this loop goes on and on and on until the end of the combat scenario. And then this loop goes into greater detail. There are two very famous slides and one long one that, instead of this loop idea that goes around, is just straight left to right so that it can be a little bit more detailed. And this was sort of an inspiration and kind of a model for my own loop. And there's my loop again. So what's going to happen now is I'm going to take us through an example of how to apply this loop to music performance training. So the next slide here is going to be maybe the most important excerpt in the orchestral timpani repertoire from a standpoint of orchestral auditions. This is the coda of the first movement of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. This is from the Breitkopf edition. And the excerpt starts right here and runs out to the end of the page. Hopefully you can see my mouse there. So one very common problem spot within this excerpt is if you look at the second to the last line at letter S, these 8 bars of this 30-second note figure of 9 notes, digga 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 da. It's very common in especially the early period of someone trying to become, trying to take orchestral auditions, or even just standard music performance students working in percussion. It's very common for those 30-second notes to be uneven rhythmically, and then later on, as the rhythm gets settled and is being played correctly, for those 30-second notes to be in time and in correct rhythm, but to be uneven tonally. So what Jason Heim talks a lot about is things like syllables of articulation. So if the ideal articulation there is da 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 da, the mistake might be da 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 da, right? So all of those different syllables in there create something that is distracting from the overall musical performance that gets in the way of any artistry. So that's something lower on the pyramid that gets in the way of any high-level artistry at the top of the pyramid. So the way that this works, working through the loop. So we start at motivation. I have a friend, Danny, who is interested and actively taking orchestral timpani auditions. So as Danny works on this excerpt, his motivation starts with he would like to win a job, and this is a very important excerpt, so he needs to play it well. That's that intrinsic motivation. Then it moves forward into enhanced expectancies and autonomy. So that confidence and that autonomy, he's deciding to play this, and he's deciding to play it, in his specific way that he's worked out that he thinks is the most musically compelling. And then his confidence is based on the fact that he has seen himself play it well and had some success improving on this thing over time. And then his mental conceptualization of this. So my friend Danny would go through and create a mental, imaginary, visual ideal of him playing this, well, visual and audio ideal of him playing this thing at a perfect level as best he can perceive it at that time, of, again, of him playing it, not of, the best player in the world in his mind, but of Danny himself playing it. And using visualization to create it, contextual interference, I'll leave that off of this presentation for right now, but it can be valuable in certain ways. And then external focus, making sure that he's not focusing necessarily on his hands and forearms and all of that, but focusing on the sticks and the drums themselves. And then pre-performance routines. So going back to the part, if we're looking at that segment at S, if the problem that Danny's having at that moment in time is evenness of tone and articulation in the 30-second note figure at S, if that's the problem, then his cue word within the centering pre-performance routine that comes from Don Green might just be the word even. So in the last few seconds before he starts the excerpt up here at this first D right here, Danny might take his breaths, and then on the third one, might just say to himself in his mind, even, to get himself set on what the goal of that performance is, on what he wants to make sure is his concept in order to have a successful run of this. So that's his pre-performance routine. Then he performs. Maybe he takes an audition. Maybe he plays for a lesson or a master class. Maybe he's just getting 100 reps of it over the course of some practice sessions. And then we go into feedback. So this is where he uses his self-recording. That's where he gets feedback from himself, plays mock auditions for peers, takes a lesson. That's the coach feedback. And then let's say, for example, over a course of a few months, Danny has now fixed his problem with with evenness in the 30-second note figure at S. What's going to happen then is we move into target behaviors, looking for those inflection points. And as that lower pyramid problem is now fixed, we look for something higher on the pyramid. So for example, the next thing that that might be a really big deal in this particular excerpt is the role or it's marked as a trill in the last measure of that second to the last line after the 32nd note figure on the sempre fortissimo. That roll is very common to be overplayed and get kind of an ugly sound out of the low drum there. And it's also very common for that roll to be kind of underplayed because people are afraid of getting that sound. So, you know, that kind of Goldilocks zone of playing just right, that sempre fortissimo roll, can be hard to achieve correctly. So as Danny now, or as just our hypothetical player has fixed the problem of articulation, syllable interpretation within 32nd notes of S, now the focus becomes on that roll. And that's the new target behavior. That's the new, you know, one measure out of 30 or 40 that becomes the defining element of whether this is a successful repetition or an unsuccessful performance of this particular excerpt. So moving back into the loop here, that's target behaviors. Moving into motivation. On the autonomy front, because the player now has a new target behavior and understands what the variable is between success and failure, or success and not so much success, that gives the player that feeling of autonomy, that feeling of control, that what happens as a result of this performance is in my control because I have this knowledge of what the variable is. And then enhanced expectancies, that's confidence again. Because the player has fixed this specific problem with the evenness in the 32nd notes at S, that is new confidence that the player has seen that their work over time is effective and they are improving. So that increases their level of confidence. Then moving into mental conceptualization, now the imagined, visualized, perfect, ideal performance of that performer is now specifically focused on that role, because everything else right now is going as well as it can be perceived to go. And that specific role is the new point of emphasis. So then we move into pre-performance routines. Now the word even as a cue word is not quite so valuable anymore because that problem has been fixed. So we can kind of shelf that unless it you know, rears its head up again down the line. And the role being a correct dynamic and a correct tone and a correct kind of mood for the piece becomes the new goal of a given pre-performance routine to prepare the performance. So the new cue word might be correct tone of role, and that's multiple words, but that's kind of okay. You know, correct role or, you know, velocity might be too technical. That's too much about hands and stroke type and that sort of thing. So, you know, open role or singing role might be a good cue word in that spot. Then again, we have the performance or the significant amount of practice that is, you know, being self-recorded. And then we get into feedback, and the player watches their videos, listens to their audio, and checks and sees what does that role sound like now, goes and plays some mock auditions and sees what the feedback about that role is, takes a lesson and sees what the feedback about that role is, what their teacher thinks, how improvement is occurring over time. And then you know, moves forward, and let's say over a course of a couple of months or maybe weeks or maybe even a year or something like that, whatever the time frame is, eventually that problem gets fixed, and then a new target behavior higher up on the pyramid appears, something else that needs to get fixed. So in consultation with the coach, the player comes up with a new target behavior. What needs to be fixed? What's the 2 or 5 or 1% issue that needs to be fixed right now that is the most glaring problem within this this excerpt? Or, you know, it doesn't have to be an orchestral excerpt, within whatever music is being performed that needs to be worked on right here. And then what is a plan to work on it? What's an exercise? What's you know, something that the player can do on a daily basis in their practice sessions in order to work on that? And then as that next target behavior shows up, you move back around into motivation, enhanced expectancies, more confidence because now 2 problems have been solved instead of 1, additional autonomy because now the player has even more understanding of what is required for just a good performance to happen. And then, you know, kind of like a car engine, this loop keeps exploding on itself around and around and around until, you know, the player keeps improving and improving and improving. And you know, there is no end, because as everyone knows within music performance, there is no perfection, there is no achieving greatness and then you set the horn down and you're done. This thing just continues and continues and continues as the player continues to approach the you know, the non-existent ideal of perfection that, you know, as musicians we all understand can't actually be achieved. So this is the end of my presentation here. I hope this made sense. If you have any questions, you can certainly reach out to me at sm6281@nyu.edu, or you can, you know, find me online on any number of social media or my website or that kind of thing. I'd be very interested in any questions anyone has, or certainly any feedback or suggestions or something like that. In any case, thank you very much for your time. My name is Sean Millman. I'm a fifth-year PhD candidate in percussion performance at NYU, and I appreciate your time. Thank you.